Matt Goodwin, of course, is joining University of Buckingham. So that's a big moment for us at Buckingham. So welcome. The context, of course, is the fight for free speech and the fight to save the university and higher education as a whole. So we're hoping Buckingham and, of course, the Center for Heterodox Social Science, of which you are affiliated, and also MCC, it's worth saying, who are also affiliated, that the attempt here to try and sort of introduce some viewpoint diversity into higher education in Britain.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you to everybody watching this online. Just for context, Professor Eric Kaufmann has set up probably the first research center really in Western Europe, I think, that's going to have a dedicated program of study focused on cultural socialism, woke ideology, all of the things that should normally be studied within contemporary social science, but for lots of reasons that we all know about, mainly the ideological imbalance in the universities, many of those issues are not really discussed. So, I'm joining the center, in theory, have been part of the center certainly for a few months, but officially now joining, which I think is a wonderful time to be doing that, given that if you look at higher education across the West at the moment, what we're seeing is a proliferation of new research centers, institutions, universities that are basically committed to restoring universities to what they're supposed to do, the search for truth, for evidence, reason through good faith debate. And I was struck at the recent art conference in London, listening to, among other people, Douglas Murray's lecture on the need for reconstruction. And I think the centre at Buckingham, and certainly Buckingham itself, is part of that reconstruction mission in trying to rebalance the landscape that over the last certainly 50 years has moved sharply to the left. The other thing that I should say at the outset is we do have support from European colleagues and networks, including MCC, who have a strong presence, as some of you will know, in places like Brussels, Austria, Hungary, and elsewhere, and who I think are also very supportive of this fact that while we talk a lot about diversity in the West today, we don't really talk about diversity of thought, diversity of opinion. So I think that this is absolutely something that should be celebrated, and over time, I'm sure Eric will come back and say a bit about this, what we're going to see at the Centre at Buckingham, we're going to see a lot of collaboration in terms of academic conferences, research seminars, student exchange programs, summer schools, a lot of activity that I think will be very public, will be very visible, will be very high impact, trying to convey the importance of heterodox social science. So before turning to Toby, Eric, you might want to say about what some remarks about what we've got coming up, as well as perhaps some brief information about your online programs that I think a lot of people out there will want to know about.
Well, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so we've got, first of all, an open online course on Woke 15 weeks, and you can take that either passively, that is just consume the lectures and the readings, or you can take it in the form of 15 live weekly seminars as well. We also have, of course, a growing master's and PhD program, and I've been very encouraged by how steadily that has grown, a London-based Buckingham MA program. So, and all the students that are coming on that, I would say, have been refugees from the mainstream system. It shows there's a real demand there. What else? We've got a couple of reports we've done. We have future research reports. We want to make an impact in terms of heterodox research, and there's really two areas. One is what we might call critical woke studies. This is a very important ideology, this cultural left ideology. It is not studied at universities because it is too uncomfortable. We need to be studying it, number one. And the second thing is simply alternative social science. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about race and sex inequality of outcome, we need to know it's not just about racism and sexism. There could actually be other reasons. Family structure, for example, could be biological differences, could be a whole bunch of things between men and women that might affect outcomes. I'm not saying that's exactly the right answer, but these are sets of theories we should be exploring with data in a good faith way. So there are a lot of questions that are just shut down, that are not being explored. So we're getting a very skewed production of knowledge. So we're not actually getting truth in an objective way in the social sciences. Now, can you publish a paper arguing that puberty blockers are actually negative for a young person? That's a very difficult thing to do. That's just another example of this. So research is a huge area. And so one of the things we're doing is we're holding a conference in June on what I call post-progressivism in the social sciences. Can we talk about a new paradigm and a new research agenda in the social sciences? So we're going to have a lot of big names coming: Steven Pinker, Ayan, Chris Rufo, a whole bunch of other people coming to that conference. So these are just some of the things we're doing. I just want to bring Toby in, of course, because the whole free speech angle is a huge part of this. Can you have free speech, when you have punishment for speech, but also when you have such a high level of political bias and discrimination that everyone who, people who have different views self-censor. And of course, Toby, you and Matt and I have been involved in the academic higher education free speech bill. I mean, what's your sense of the freedom of speech landscape in Britain and more generally across the West right now?
Yeah, well, I think it's not great. If you look back at the Free Speech Union has fought over 3,500 cases in the last 5 years, and about 15% of them have been either academics or students who've run afoul of kind of various progressive orthodoxies in higher ed institutions. So that's over 500 cases. I think, am I working that out right? I think something like that. We haven't seen any slackening off in the number of people, academics and students, asking for our help. I think the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which we all worked on, has had a positive impact, even though it hasn't yet been implemented in full. As you know, one of Bridget Phillipson's, the Education Secretary's, first moves was to torpedo the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which meant its implementation has been delayed at best, and the Free Speech Union legally challenged that decision. We thought it was unlawful, and we JR'd Bridget Phillipson, and a few days before that hearing was due to take place in the High Court, she announced in the House of Commons that she was essentially doing a U-turn and was going to implement most of, if not all of, the remaining clauses of the Freedom of Speech Act. So I think we will see a bit of improvement then, and I think the fact that it's in the pipeline and been anticipated, at least by English universities, because it only affects English universities, unfortunately, has seen some English universities introducing freedom of speech policies which have been slightly more robust, protections which have been slightly more robust in anticipation of the law changing, and some of them have kind of withdrawn them, others have left them in place. But I think we're beginning to see the outlines of an improving picture in which academic freedom and free speech on English university campuses is slightly better protected, but we've still got a very long way to go, obviously.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging. Then, I mean, the FSU's been has been huge in this country, and I certainly benefited when I was being canceled from the FSU backing me up. So that's been an enormous force. Hopefully, the FSU in Canada can start to make headway in that disastrous situation there.
Let me ask you guys a question. I remember a couple of years ago when you were both debating whether to stay, in your case at Birkbeck, in your case at Kent, whether it was better to stay and fight for heterodox social science within your departments, or whether the cause was essentially hopeless and it was better to decamp to an arc like Buckingham, where at least you could pursue your work in a relatively free environment, unthreatened by, woke activists constantly deluging your department with complaints about your behavior and so forth, and having to deal with these endless vexatious investigations. Did you eventually both conclude that actually it was better to, assemble in one place where you had relative freedom of maneuver than to try and fight it out at Birkbeck or Kent?
Well, I'll just say something on that, which is I think we need a mixed economy. So I think that you can have people inside the mainstream system, like the gender critical feminists. They minimize the amount of time they spend on campus. They only come in for their teaching. They mutually support each other. You can survive in that climate without, and with the right Freedom of Speech Act, you're not going to get fired or pushed out. So I think it is a tolerable existence. But the problem with that, you need that. But you're not going to be able to get a environment that is not hostile for people who are agreeable. And in fact, if we look at the fire surveys in the US, the political composition of the student body, regardless of how good the university policies are, the political composition, liberal conservative of the student body is the number one far and away driver of how much self-censoring goes on. So the only way we get people, yes, we can stop censorship, but to stop self-censorship, you need to have an oasis. And that it's a sad thing. We need to have these oases where we have a critical mass of people that are really free. They know their career, their reputation, their social life is not going to be impacted by expressing themselves. So I think we need both the oases, but we also need people inside the mainstream system. We can't give up, in my view, on the mainstream system. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think in my case, the decision was helped by the financial crisis that has basically been blowing through the UK higher education system. And, we're speaking now at the very beginning of March 2025, but over the last week, we had, I thought, quite an impressive essay in the Times by the historian Neil Ferguson, saying that on the one hand, we've got a major financial crisis like the one that engulfed Kent, where you're seeing non-elite universities basically, hemorrhaging resource and funding as the student cap was taken off, and the more elite Russell Group universities hoovered up students, and universities further down the league table were then hit very hard by that. And of course, we've not been increasing tuition fees in line with inflation. So the end result was, they've been basically dumping lecturers, senior lecturers and professors to try and make up the shortfall. So in some sense, that decision was taken for me. But at the same time, I'd also become acutely aware, I think, through watching things like the University of Austin, through watching things like the Peterson Academy, which Eric has been involved with, also through watching networks like MCC, looking at what they've been doing in places like Brussels, Austria, Budapest, and elsewhere. I do think there is a new ecosystem that is more impactful than the legacy universities have sometimes been. I mean, to give you the famous stat that 85% of academic articles are basically never read by anybody except the author and maybe one or two peer reviewers. So if you are able to step outside of the traditional academic conversation and you're able to write in a more flexible way, research reports, trade books, Substacks, podcasts, whatever, I think the impact that you can have is also much greater. I'm a lot more gloomy on the universities today than I used to be, and the only silver lining I can see is maybe the Trump administration in the US finally saying, look, diversity, equality, and inclusion, the sort of DEI agenda, or we tend to call it the EDI agenda in the UK, is kind of over. But I mean, there's very little evidence that that's happening in the UK. I mean, as Neil pointed out the weekend, if you look at Oxford, it's just committed, £2.5 million to DEI jobs. That agenda is firmly fixed. And more fundamentally, the bad governance structures are entrenched. I mean, if you take, for example, a culture war skirmish that we've just experienced at Buckingham, it's very similar in some respects to the skirmish that the young researcher Noah Carl experienced at Cambridge, whereby what you often find, the people who are at the very epicenter of that, the masters of the colleges or the chairs of the council, are often basically former bankers, former financial services people who have no real experience of academic life, certainly have no real sense of commitment to the traditional virtues of academic life, to things like academic freedom, good faith debate. And so they're often the first to say, well, let's get rid of this controversial speaker, or let's get rid of this controversial academic in the name of protecting the emotional safety of students or protecting the reputation of the institution and preserving its place in league tables. And I am somewhat won over by that argument that, you know, we've got an ideological crisis, undoubtedly, and partly the Centre for Heterodox Social Science is going to be calling that out. I think we also have a governance crisis, you know, whereby we have a kind of a layer of leadership within higher education that is just, to be frank, incompetent and driven by the wrong incentive structures. And then we also have this looming financial crisis. So it's not an easy time to be navigating higher education. I just hope that maybe that wind from America, once it becomes entrenched and people begin to understand that diversity, equality, and inclusion is really the opposite of what it says or what it claims to mean. I just hope some of that can be implemented here in the UK and Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth adding, by the way, that in this country, the UKRI, which disperses a total of 9 billion in grants to well, 9 billion in funds to UK universities, is thoroughly permeated with DEI. And in fact, a report that we'll be putting out at the center is tracking that with the assistance of somebody we both know, David Rosado, who does big data. So the same trends that you've seen with the National Science Foundation in the United States, with the tri-councils in Canada, this explosion of DEI is occurring here. And now, of course, the research assessment exercise, the REF 2029, is intending now to track you know, hiring and promotion by race and sex, for example, and that's going to affect your score, which is going to heavily skew all of the incentives towards DEI. So yeah, in Britain, the picture is pretty grim, as it is in most other countries outside the US. Of course, the US, it's interesting now with what's occurred, the banning of DEI, the gutting of the National Science Foundation. Now, of course, there are risks here. I mean, one of which is Trump. This is also going to be associated with Trump's positions on Ukraine, on January 6th rioters, and all these other things, which could be a negative. But on the other hand, it does show that government action can bring these things to an end. And I think that's the positive that's coming out of this, right? So I do think if that lesson can be learned by some future administration, but to do it in a way that's a little bit more, you know, civil and processual, perhaps. I think there's an option. What do you think, Toby?
Let me give you, I obviously sounded a bit more optimistic than Matt there, but let me give you one more reason for being pessimistic and then some reasons for being more optimistic. One more reason for being pessimistic is Clause 18 of the Employment Rights Bill, which is a big flagship Labour government bill. Clause 18 extends employer liability for the harassment of their employees to the harassment of their employees by third parties. Now, effectively, it's turbocharging the Equality Act. Under the Equality Act as it stands, organisations like Stonewall have often made the argument that universities have a legal duty to no platform, say, GC feminists on campus, because allowing them onto campus constitutes harassment of their non-binary and trans employees. And they have a duty under the Equality Act to protect those employees with protected characteristics from being exposed to these points of view that make them feel unsafe and threatened. Now, that's a misreading of the Equality Act, which Stonewall has encouraged many universities to do. But under the Equality Act, employers don't currently have a legal duty to protect their employees from the harassment of third parties, if you want to present it as harassment. So they don't have a legal duty to protect their employees from visiting speakers as under the Equality Act as it stands. But under Clause 18 of the Employment Rights Bill, if it becomes law, they will. So that argument that Stonewall wanted to make, but which wasn't legally sound, will become legally sound if Clause 18 of the Employment Rights Bill becomes law. And student activists on staff will be able to weaponize this and say, we can't possibly invite these speakers with these heterodox views onto campus because you have a legal duty to protect your employees with protected characteristics from being harassed in this way, having to listen to these alternative points of view, which will obviously be traumatic and cause them psychological discomfort, whatever. But it hasn't yet become law. And now that I'm in the Lords, I'm hoping that me and my colleagues can amend the Employment Rights Bill and persuade the government to remove Clause 18, it hardly sits well with the kind of pro-growth agenda. If you think about the compliance costs in the hospitality sector, you know, publicans will have to protect their staff from overhearing conversations they might find upsetting or offensive. So they'll have to employ banter bouncers and send customers on diversity training courses. So the compliance costs are going to be huge, not exactly pro-growth. Maybe we can make some headway in persuading the government to drop that. Reasons to be more optimistic. Well, the Royal Society last night decided not to eject Elon Musk. I thought that was quite encouraging, in spite of a fairly dedicated, energetic campaign by a former Imperial College diversity-crat to try and Stephen Curry, to try and force, you know, he produced one of these open letters. He got over 3,000 signatures from various distinguished scientists saying, no, Elon Musk has no place in the Royal Society. He's bringing it into disrepute. He's associated with the Trump administration. He's anti-science and so on and so forth. Well, it looks like the Royal Society have resisted that pressure and said, no, he can remain a fellow. So I think that's encouraging. Matt talked about the financial crisis. Maybe one consequence of that financial crisis will be some of the more woke university departments going broke. You know, they're subsidized, they're not very popular. Maybe, you know, we've seen kind of various humanities departments go to the wall over the past 1 or 2 years. Many of them have kind of embraced the entire radical progressive agenda, hook, line, and sinker. Hasn't done them any favors. They've now gone out of business. Maybe we'll see a kind of tacking back towards pragmatism and common sense in the wake of these financial pressures. One reason for optimism.
Is there an issue, however, that the universities that are suffering the most financially are the least influential, bottom feeders, and the ones which are really the hotbeds of woke, which are the sort of Russell Group elite universities, are going to emerge unscathed because they have the reputations in the pecking order. But although I think you're right that in certain cases, some department, I don't know, Sussex, I don't know, some of them will suffer for this reason.
I think one trend we might see, I think it was encouraging that William Hague became the new Chancellor of Oxford, and he's the best, I think, of the candidates, and seemingly very committed to academic freedom and free speech. And I think under his stewardship, Oxford might embrace institutional neutrality in the same way that Harvard has in the wake of the pro-Palestinian protests. That seems to be a burgeoning trend in the United States. The Chicago principles gradually becoming adopted, taken up by other institutions, and they essentially, you know, can be summarized as institutional neutrality. So it's possible that Oxford embraces institutional neutrality, and that then in turn is embraced by Cambridge and other high-status universities, and that could be a positive development. I mean, another reason for optimism, and you may have noticed this amongst your students, is that, you know, the digital native generation, kids born, you know, after what, 2010 or 2005, tend to be a little bit less woke than their immediate predecessors. I mean, I've certainly noticed that amongst my children and amongst their friends. There seems to be, you know, it's not quite as dramatic as a backlash. Yeah. But, you know, and we see this across Europe too, with, you know, young people embracing parties like the ADF and the National Front in France, and, you know, Reform seems to be doing pretty well amongst people, you know, age 25 and under.
But a big gender split, though, right? So
Yeah.
we are, like in Germany, it was young men more AFD, but young women heavily to the far left. And
Yeah.
so I think I think they're going to be very polarized. I think it's too early to say that, in fact, that they're jettisoning woke views. I would want to be that optimistic, but although there are certain places.
Yeah, and also, if I may, because we only have 8 minutes left on this call, one of the things that struck me from the Harvard experience at the same time, Toby, is that nobody who presided over the Claudine Gay fiasco at Harvard actually lost their jobs. And I think one of the points out there being that until we see changes in the governance of elite universities and people really suffering consequences for backing this political, you know, this extreme political project, you know, we're not going to get that culture change. So hopefully, you know, at Buckingham, what we're trying to do with the appointments that are happening, with the research centre, with the collaboration with other research centres across Europe and other networks, I think, you know, it is about trying to plant a countercultural flag, you know, in that higher education landscape. And I know, just briefly towards the end, I mean, the things that we've got coming up around, you know, big research conference, as Eric mentioned, with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Chris Rufo, who basically single-handedly changed the debate on higher education in the US. I thought that was great. We've got summer schools coming up. We've got individual, you know, talks, presentations. We've got the Margaret Thatcher weekend conference coming up as well. So there's a lot of activity happening at Buckingham. I just wonder, Eric, in the limited time that we have left, is there anything you want to summarize and just convey to our audience while we have the chance?
I want to add something which is for any US listeners or transatlantic listeners, that one of the other distinctive properties of this center is that if you look across the American higher education landscape, almost all of the new institutes and centers are focused on the great books, the humanities, the American Constitution, free market economics. Those are all extremely important things. We have to preserve them. What is missing is the alternative countercultural social science, politics, psychology, sociology, social history. And that's very important when it comes to shaping school curricula, when it comes to policy making. And so we're hoping that our center becomes the kind of transatlantic one-stop hub where people can search for any academic articles to counter prevailing narratives. And of course, one of the points here is it's important to have the podcast. It's important to have the journalism that is countercultural and online, but it is also useful to have the academic bona fides, the backup that says these are people who've done the, on top of the literature, there's done the detailed analysis. So we do need some of that academic expertise to backstop this shift in knowledge. And if I'm optimistic, maybe, and I don't know your thoughts, I think there are some signs of this vibe shift at the very top of, particularly in the United States. And even I was astounded to see Ash Sarkar claiming that woke is not something that she wants to continue doing. So are we in the midst of a potential elite culture shift, and can we accelerate that?
Well, that's great. With only a few minutes remaining, I think it would probably be a good moment to bring the discussion to a close, rather than us be unceremonially kicked off. But can I just take a moment to thank Lord Toby Young for joining us, Eric Kaufmann for all of his work at Buckingham in delivering and overseeing the centre. Can we also thank MCC for their support, and also James Tooley at Buckingham for his support as well. And for anybody watching online, all of the courses that Eric mentioned are available online at the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham, and all of the events I'm sure are listed there as well. But I think for now we'll thank everybody for joining us and bring the call to a close.
I should just say, Matt, congratulations on your new role at Buckingham. I look forward to seeing your unconstrained research.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. It's been a long time coming. Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Matt.